All right, everyone. Hope you had a great weekend. If you're playing golf, I hope it went really, really well. Let's get into this week's subject, and we're going to talk about hip or pelvis sway. So, firstly, what does that really mean? It means an excessive amount of lateral movement away from the target through the pelvis or through the hips in the backswing. Now, again, to keep this simple, we're just going to really use the right hip as the reference point. You could also look at the pelvis, the center of the pelvis, get into the idea of recentering, etc. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole in terms of what we want to look at today. We're just going to look around the right hip in terms of what might we see from players, what might be the best, most efficient move, or how to move in the most efficient capacity. So again, using Tommy as the example here, what we might see if we looked online in terms of coaching would be the idea if I put a line opposite the right hip pocket, what we would see early is a little shift towards that line early as the player creates momentum in the golf club. And then as they work towards the top of the backswing, that right hip pocket's starting to move away from that green line. So when the player gets to, let's say, completing their backswing, we would actually have a little gap now in between where the hip pocket started and where it is at top of backswing. Again, some might refer to this as recentering of the pelvis, that the pelvis has now moved away a little bit in the backswing and then come back to its original spot at top of backswing, which is absolutely fine if you want to refer to it as that. We're just going to, again, keep it a little bit more simplified. So that'll be one way of looking at it in terms of, okay, let's go back to the start. We have this little line on the right hip pocket. We have a little bump towards that line at the start to create momentum in the club head, to shift the weight, to gather momentum or force in that trail foot. And then we start seeing that right hip pocket start to move a little bit back. So let's have a look at that from a 3D perspective. So this is looking with Sportsbox at Tommy's 3D, and we've got a few little values down here. We've got the chest sway, the pelvis turn, and the pelvis sway. So let's go into the swing. And let's start off. We've started off at 0. Let's work our way back, and let's see what the highest number we get. Now, again, a minus would be the pelvis moving laterally away from the target. So let's keep an eye on down here. We'll just change that little arrow to a green arrow because that's the one we really want to focus on. So how high does that number really become? So as you're working back, how high does it get to? Well, about minus 0.5. So not a lot of real lateral shift there. So we start off at 0. We work our way back. Minus 0.5. Does it get any higher? No. And now it starts moving back towards the target till we get up top of backswing. And now it's actually an inch further or closer to the target than it was at address. So we've started off at 0. We've had that little shift away, maximizing or getting to its maximum point around here, 0, so half an inch further away than it was at address, and now starting to recenter. And again, this is more of a reference on the center of the pelvis, but we'll use visually the right hip. So we have that one example. That player that starts off has a very minimal shift, half an inch away, and then starts to turn back towards the target. And by the time they actually get up to the top of the backswing, the pelvis is nearly an inch more closer to the target than they were at address. How about we look at a different player? Let's look at Rory. And we're also going to look at Rory's 3D over here on the right-hand side. So let's get the swing on the left-hand side, and we'll do the same little kind of visual guide we did before because many people don't have access to 3D. So we'll put that little line in on the right hip pocket. And what do we see from Rory? So as he goes back, we don't really see that right hip go back as early as we did with Tommy. So you could say maybe there is that lateral shift. There's that little push to the right. But the hip kind of hangs out there. It doesn't really create that gap as early as we saw with Tommy. Now that gap gets created, but it's a little later. It's more as Rory actually starts to go in transition that we see that gap. So a little bit more delayed. But let's see if the 3D backs that up. So again, we've got our pelvis sway number down in here. So let's see what Rory does. So we have it at 0. We work our way back. And already we're actually moved more away than Tommy was. So Tommy, again, the maximum was half an inch. We're now over 1.5 inches, 2 inches, 2.2, 2.3, 2.5, 2.6. So we get to a maximum of 2.6 right there at the same point in time that Tommy was only half an inch. So 2 inches more of sway through the pelvis with Rory. And then we start recentering. But when we get to the top of the backswing, we're just under an inch away from where we started. So the fact that Rory has moved laterally more in the backswing, okay, over, again, going back to where we kind of go to the maximum there, about 2.5, 2.6 inches. So he's moved over 2 inches more away from the target in backswing than Tommy has. So therefore, relatively speaking, as he gets to the top of the backswing, he is further away than Tommy is. And again, as you know, both incredibly impressive golfers. So, which is right, which is wrong? Well, who's to say? But let's look at another golfer. And we're going to look at Ludwig Åberg. And again, we're going to grab his 3D. So when we look at this, we'll get that down to 0. Let's do the same thing. Okay, so again, from just a visual 2D perspective, let's put that little line in on the right hip pocket. We'll get a little closer there, as close as we can. And let's work our way into the backswing. So we see that early shift again. However, we don't really see that recentering with this player. That kind of hip kind of stays out there, right? So again, we're talking about the pelvis, but we're using the hip as the reference point. Kind of stays out there. And then it starts to move back, but we don't really get past that line. We don't see that gap we've seen with Tommy, with Rory, until very, very late in that downswing position. So again, this is a different pattern. So we're starting off with seeing Tommy, little lateral at the start, but then very much moving back or recentering, creating that gap. Rory, a little bit less. Okay, now as we look at Ludwig and we go into this backswing, again, let's keep an eye on that pelvis sway number because that's the number we're using as our reference. How much sway do we have? So we go back, we go 2.1. So we actually get about the same amount as Rory, but we kind of hang out there a little bit more. So as we get up top here, top of that backswing, right about there somewhere, we're nearly minus 2.3 inches away. So we don't really have that recentering that we had with Rory. We nearly have that pushing, loading, one might say, into that trail side to the top of the backswing position. So now very much more pressure, let's say, in that trail side, more mass, let's say, in that trail side than Tommy or Rory in what we're seeing right now. And then in transition, we get the movement back. So the recentering, the kind of back to 0, let's say, kind of happening around here somewhere, back to where he originally came from. So when you look at this and we bring in the kind of the spectrums, we have Tommy over here, and we have Ludwig over here. Now, again, you're going to point out one is hitting a fairway wood, one is hitting an iron. This pattern really remains quite similar, whether he's hitting iron or wood on the right-hand side with what Ludwig does in terms of what I've seen so far. But again, if we were to look at that and just put that little line in, and maybe you've seen this done before in your own assessment of your own golf swing, we look at Tommy, that gap is created up top. We look at Ludwig, well, we've actually increased the gap. There is no gap anymore. We've actually gone the other way. So which one is right and which one is wrong? Which one is good? Which one is bad? Which one is efficient? Which one is not efficient? Well, both these players are incredibly talented and top 10 players in the world. So when you're looking at how that trail hip, how the pelvis moves in backswing, there's no black and white in this. There's no I have to be here, I have to be here. There are numbers, however. So let's say Ludwig moved another 2 inches. Let's say he was out here, maybe he was 4 inches. Now that could be a problem. So when you're looking at this in terms of spectrums, you would say, all right, if I've seen Ludwig over here and he's moved 2 inches away in the backswing and he's still a really, really good player, all right? So now I've seen someone that does it 2 inches. Now, have I ever seen someone do it 4 inches? Well, not really. So until I see that player, I would say that that's outside the spectrum. So when you would look at your own golf swing and you go, okay, if I get to 4 inches, that's a little bit too much. I can move the way Ludwig does. I can load into that right side if I prefer to, but around the maximum I really want to be at top of backswing is about 2 inches away from where I started from, and that gives me enough or ample opportunity to get back to where I really want to be or need to be at impact. I can also be like Tommy, where I'm actually a little bit closer, an inch closer than where I was at address. Could I be 3 inches closer? Could I move 3 inches more this way? Possibly. Could I be 4 inches more closer than I was at address? I've yet to see someone be 4 inches that way and be really, really good in terms of what they do. So again, when I'm looking at this in terms of movement, I would say when I'm looking at a player, again, about 2.5, 3 inches is the maximum you really want in that backswing. Preferably 2 is kind of the limit. And then when you look at the top of backswing, how much towards the target you really want a player to be, again, looking at it, 4 is an awful lot. 3, 2.5 would probably be about the limit in terms of that as a reference point. So hopefully this gives you a bit of context when looking at the pelvis overall, or even the trail hip as we've used as a reference point in terms of today, about rotation and possible excessive sway in the backswing. Any questions around this subject, please feel free to ask.